The 1989 European Parliament election was held across the 12 EC member states in June 1989. It marked the third European election, but it was the first time that Spain and Portugal voted simultaneously with the other members since their joining of the European Commission in 1986. Ineptly, the previous two direct Euro elections were disappointing. Turnout was low, with 60.7% in 1979 and 57% in 1984. The elections seemed to function more as plebiscites on the performance of national governments rather than as genuinely transnational events. Politicians struggled to demonstrate their relevance to a wider public. The third Euro elections followed a similar path, both in terms of voter participation and the prevailing rationale behind the electoral campaigns of the political parties vying for popular support across the 12 EC member states. In most countries, European elections are often seen as merely beauty contests between national parties, primarily focused on national political concerns. These elections do not directly impact the composition of the national government. Consequently, many analysts studying voting behavior in European elections have reached the conclusion that party choices in these elections are influenced by normal national factors. The absence of formal results for those in power allows voters to express themselves more freely and be more experimental in their choices to some extent. In European elections, where no supranational governmental power is allocated, it is natural for parties to prioritize national reasons and instrumentalize the elections accordingly. What's more, the absence of integrating factors such as a common electoral law and election day, even symbolically, contributes to perceiving the direct elections to the European Parliament as a collection of loosely coordinated national elections rather than a truly European election. During the first two European elections, campaigns in most member states were in fact dominated by national aspects, and there is an argument that the 1984 elections witnessed a further renationalization compared to 1979. Regarding the third direct elections in 1989, the situation remained unchanged. Transnational actors, such as the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European party federations, held minor relevance, and genuine European issues rarely played a significant role in shaping the campaigns. It is understandable that in countries where national elections were held together, the transnational dimension of the European election itself was largely marginalized. In Greece, for instance, the campaign revolved around the scandals that had been rocking the country for some time. Increasing indications of involvement by the government and the ruling PASOK's party's elite, including Prime Minister Papandreou, in these aspersions dominated the narrative. In Ireland, where Prime Minister Haughey called for a concurrent national election just 3 weeks before the European elections, the campaign was centered on national economic and social issues. In Luxembourg, a recently established action committee successfully made the issue of extending the civil servants' pension a central focus of the campaign for all Luxembourgs reaching retirement age. Apart from the three countries where national and European elections coincided, two other countries experienced national governmental crises shortly before the European elections, leading to a prominent focus on national aspects during the direct election campaigns. In the Netherlands, Prime Minister Lebbers, a member of the Christian Democratic Party, resigned following the rejection of the government's proposed financing measures for a comprehensive national environmental protection plan by the parliamentary group of his coalition partner, the Liberals. Despite the announcement of general elections scheduled for September, which was expected to generate mobilization of the European election campaign, these expectations were unfulfilled. In Italy, Prime Minister De Mita resigned in mid-May, and his relinquishment came after losing his position as the chairman of the Christian Democratic Party in February and facing political attacks from Bettino Craxi, the chairman of his crucial coalition partner, the Socialists. The European election provided an opportunity for the Italian parties to gauge their relative strength ahead of new coalition negotiations. The start of the campaign was notably marked by the government crisis and its consequences, which held significant sway. However, towards the end, domestic concerns were overshadowed by the violent crackdown of the protest movement in China. This event was vigorously exploited by bourgeois and right-wing parties to launch vehement attacks on the Italian Communist Party, labeling it as an ideological accomplice of the Chinese regime. Even in countries without governmental crisis or simultaneous general elections, Europe remained a secondary concern during the campaigns. In Belgium, the liberal opposition faced challenges in differentiating itself from the successful ruling coalitions comprised of the Socialists, Christian Democrats, and the Flemish VU. Eventually, the campaign unfolded with minimal inter-party conflict, focusing neither on national nor European issues. Similarly, in Germany, Europe played a minor role. Alongside discussions about the right-wing Republicans, public interests primarily revolved around international affairs, such as developments in China and the missile controversy within NATO, as well as the visits of George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. In France, as in many other countries, major parties encountered difficulties in setting themselves apart from their opponents on European policies. Although the European dimension had some presence, the European election ultimately functioned as a national test election. The primary focus was on how voters would respond to the attempt to restructure the bourgeois opposition through two separate lists: a centre list, led by Simone Veil, and the UDF-RPR list, led by Giscard d'Estaing. Similarly, in Portugal, the European election was primarily viewed through a national lens, particularly for the socialist opposition, who had suffered clear electoral defeats in the past two national elections. This occasion provided an opportunity to present themselves as a viable alternative to the Social Democrats, who had held an absolute majority since 1987. The European election in Spain also had a significant national test character, as the political landscape had been influenced by the conflict between Felipe González's socialist government and the trade unions regarding state economic policy. This dynamic presented an opportunity for the opposition's People's Party to break free from its long-standing stagnation and make political gains. In Denmark and Great Britain, where a campaign with a strong European dimension was anticipated due to specific conflict configurations regarding European matters, the dynamics had shifted towards this particular election. In Denmark, public opinion surveys had indicated a growing pro-European sentiment for some time, and in February 1986, the majority of Danes had approved the Single European Act in a referendum. As a result, the question of Danish membership in the European Commission was no longer a prominent issue on the political agenda. While the People's Movement against the EC, comprising components of the EC from various parties, participated again, the campaign was primarily dominated by a domestic issue, albeit partially influenced by European considerations: the tax and budgetary reform plan proposed by the bourgeois coalition government in May. In Great Britain, on the other hand, the Labour Party, which had adopted a more pragmatic stance compared to 1979, showcased a noticeably pro-European rhetoric to the voters. However, within the ruling Conservative Party, a controversy emerged, particularly evident in the public disputes between Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Heath regarding future European policy, which dominated a significant portion of the British campaign. It is worth noting that the Labour Party also utilised the European election campaign to seek voter judgment on 10 years of Thatcherism. In the 1989 European elections, significant losses were experienced by the major parties in all member states, except for Luxembourg. This led some political commentators to suggest the existence of the European wide wave of right-wing extremism. However, when examining the electoral results of extreme right-wing parties across the EC, it becomes evident that such an argument lacks substantial empirical evidence. While it is true that the right-wing party's share of the vote increased in 5 member states compared to the last national election, this phenomenon does not hold true to a large extent throughout the European Union. In the Flemish region of Belgium, the Vlaams Blok saw an increase in its share of the vote, at the expense of the VU and secured a seat in the European Parliament. Le Pen's National Front also experienced a 2% increase in its share. In Luxembourg, the previously insignificant National Bewegung gained 2.9% of the vote. In Italy, the MSI, which had faced an internal crisis following the death of its charismatic founder, suffered losses compared to both the previous national and European elections, resulting in the loss of one seat in the European Parliament. Lastly, the Greek National Political Union gained 1.2% of the vote in 1989, but experienced a significant decline in its share compared to the 1984 elections, ultimately losing its seat in the European Parliament. In contrast to the varying performance of right-wing parties, the Green parties experienced an overall increase in their share of the vote in the European elections compared to both the corresponding national elections and the 1984 European elections. However, Germany stands as a unique case, as the German Greens were the only Green party in the European Union that did not significantly increase its share of the vote. In all other countries, the Green parties achieved much higher gains in votes compared to the corresponding gains of the right-wing parties. Notably, the British Green Party, previously marginal, achieved the highest increase, reaching 14.5% of the vote, the highest share ever attained by a Green Party in European elections. It is worth mentioning that despite this achievement, the British Green Party is not represented in the European Parliament due to the British electoral system. In Greece, Luxembourg and Spain, the fragmentation of the Green parties into three separate entities participating in the European elections resulted in their inability to secure the EP seats that could have been attained based on their combined share of the vote in each respective country. However, in Portugal, the coalition of Communists and Greens achieved notable success, gaining 14.4% of the vote and securing 4 seats in the European Parliament. One of the seats was specifically designated for a candidate from the Greens. Among all the member states, Denmark was the only country where the Greens did not field their own electoral list or form an alliance with other parties for the European elections. Instead, they joined forces with other small left-wing parties, urging their supporters to vote for the People's Movement against the EC. When considering the European implications on the election results, it is important to note that the composition of the European Parliament following the 1989 elections cannot be directly compared to its previous composition. This comparison is further complicated by the fact that in Spain and Portugal, the first direct elections to the European Parliament were held as recently as in 1987, and there have been instances of MEPs switching parliamentary groups over the past 5 years. Contrary to the press's claims of the Europe-wide shift to the left, there has not been a significant overall swing in that direction. The increased strength of the socialist group can primarily be attributed to the British Labour Party's 5% gain in votes, resulting in an additional 13 seats. On the other hand, the Christian Democrats were able to offset the losses incurred by the poor performance of the German CDU-KSU by incorporating the Spanish Partido Popular into their group. This, along with the decline of the British Conservatives, led to a 50% reduction in the European Democratic Group's representation. The Liberals managed to compensate for the underperformance of their 2 Italian member parties with the addition of new Spanish members and the re-entry of the German FDP party. Furthermore, the extreme right-wing parties experienced a boost, with the German Republicans securing 6 seats. Nevertheless, it should be noted that only the right-wing parties from France, Germany and Belgium managed to form a technical group, resulting in no significant change in the strength of the European right. The other 2 existing parliamentary groups, prior to the 1989 elections, have split into separate groups. The Italian Communists continued their new direction in the European Parliament, distancing themselves from their more orthodox counterparts, particularly those from France. Additionally, the Greens, who were previously part of the Rainbow Group alongside Danish opponents of the EC and small regionalist parties, decided to establish their own parliamentary group. Many comments on the 1989 election emphasized the majority achieved by left-wing parties when considering the Socialists, Greens, Communists, and Rainbow Group together. However, categorizing all members of the Greens and Rainbow Group as strictly left-wing is not accurate. Furthermore, drawing definite conclusions about future left-wing policies based on seat distribution is misleading. The cohesion of European Parliament groups differs from national parliamentary groups, and the EP's role within the EC's political system requires strategic considerations. The EP's increased influence in recent years was largely due to cooperation between the Socialists and Christian Democrats. Overall, the 1989 European elections reflected a predominantly pro-integration stance among the majority of parties and voters. This can be seen as a retrospective endorsement and validation of the Parliament's endeavours and initiatives aimed at advancing further integration of the community.